Thanks so much, Steinar. And thanks everyone at the beautiful Bergen Kunsthall. This is like the most ideal place to come, as we all decided when we came for the Bergen Biennale conference. Sorry, I'm just going to get myself settled here. It's a bit of a grand irony that I get to deliver a kind of monologue on the conversation, because the entire talk is going to be about how it's not a monologue, but hopefully in some ways that can kind of sharpen the picture in some ways. I'm going to start with a little clip. Are you hearing me okay, or am I actually speaking too loud? I'm a bit unaware of, yeah. Sorry, that's Solveig's files. Okay, let's give it a go. Does anybody recognize this? It's been dubbed as the beer summit. I just realized I'm drinking a beer. But it was an incident earlier in September where this man, he's just fallen out of view, he was a professor at Harvard University. And I've completely blanked out on his first name, but his last name was Jones. So let's say Professor Jones, who's an infamous authority on race relations, was locked out of his house in Cambridge and had to break into his own home in order to get back into the house. And he was actually arrested and taken to prison by this cop who's in you can see it. But this image was an image of the kind of conversation that took place to make amends for this incredible misunderstanding of a man getting arrested in front of his own home in Cambridge, which, you know, most people speculated that he got arrested because he was black. And a black guy breaking into a house in a nice neighborhood very near Harvard looked very suspicious. And that was sort of the excuse of the police officer that that arrested him. But I wanted to start with this image because it's a really interesting instance. I'm just getting used to this computer, sorry. It's a really interesting instance where we are shown a conversation, but we have no clue what has been said. It's a pure image of a conversation, but the idea is that it is good in and of itself, and maybe in fact the fact that we cannot hear what is being said in this situation makes it a real conversation. That is the big open question, I think, for me in kind of dealing with what is happening within the art world. Steinar did a great introduction, so I can skip half of mine. Thank you very much. And yeah, exactly. I'm really interested in the phenomenon of what happens when instead of exhibitions, we choose to actually have these discursive events. That's one side of the kind of story. And in Rotterdam, we did a very similar thing, maybe to the Bergen Biennale conference, where 3 separate sessions were organized in the last year. One strictly devoted to critics, one strictly devoted to curators, and a third strictly devoted to artists, where they kind of just came for 3 days and discussed. And it was an incredibly, I mean, it was an organized event, but it was a very basic premise of just getting various agents in the field of art to kind of take time out and really get back to the most basic questions of their practice. I'm not sure if this was conceived before the economic crisis, so I don't think we can completely excuse that as the underlying premise, but I think actually what I'd rather maybe entertain is the idea that a conversation or a discussion can actually produce things, can make things happen, but at the same time I think maybe the way that we're going about it may be the wrong way. So the kind of overall premise of my essay project is to always keep in mind that it may be that no or very few real conversations are actually taking place. And this is maybe a kind of very strange thing to say, because I think conversation is considered as like the most natural thing. We have them every day at the dinner table, but the idea of actually working on something called art of conversation is to, in a sense, aestheticize it, to look at it in a different way and to really make it strange. And people have told me that they think the essays are a bit strange because they always kind of go around actual conversations and pick very odd examples, many of which I will share with you today. And then at the end of it all, we can kind of decide if it's effective or if there's still something that needs to be resolved in actually the way that that conversation is looked at. This is a funny setup because I kind of have to read my things. Okay, here we go. Also, this is not to say that something like the old art of conversation is dead. I'm not really interested in the discourse of an idea that there is an art of conversation in the 17th century that was flourishing, and somehow through various media technologies, etc., we have kind of lost touch with how to have a real conversation. I'm not really going to go there because I don't know if it's so productive to kind of call up some imaginary golden age of conversation and try to get back there. I'm going to sort of, we can keep it in the back of my mind, but that's not really, really the idea. My working definition of a conversation is that a conversation produces something. It is creative. And it should be used as a measure against talking that calls itself conversation and does not conjure a new image of the world. Because I've been reading Maurice Blanchot's Infinite Conversation, for whom this something specific that's produced, which he calls neutrality, or the initiating of significance, but signifying nothing, or nothing determined. I'm going to talk a bit more about how what I think is the ideal thing maybe to, or a very exciting thing to produce in a conversation is some kind of a space of the neutral, and I'll try to unpack that a little bit and give it some meat, because I think we have a kind of idea of neutrality as beige and eventless. Swiss, although I'm not sure if the Swiss are so neutral given their recent decisions to ban all elements from their video landscapes. So maybe that's not the best way to think of neutrality after all. Okay. What I'm going to do is try to sort of go between what I've already written, because there are certain things that I want to pull up and go through images and keep it rather free-form to a certain extent. I'm just going to find my PowerPoint here and skip very quickly to the gray spot. Whoops. I'm sorry. Okay. So starting with no image, because I kind of want to put the pressure on this event and whether or not it's possible to image conversation. And by extension, whatever happens in this room, because it's being streamed live, may have no potential for the conversational. but maybe I'm wrong. One of the most interesting examples of how Maurice Blanchot thinks of conversation, I think can be found in Steve McQueen's recent film, Hunger. Has anybody here seen Hunger? Has it come to Bergen? If you have a Cinematheque, you should try to get it, because it's a really amazing film that actually does its work because of the incredible slowness of its time. But what I'm going to do is just read a few things around how Blanchot thinks of conversation, because it's quite specific. And then we'll watch a clip from Hunger. And I think it might clarify things a little bit. So, here is Blanchot. The definition of conversation, that is the most simple description, the most simple conversation, might be the following. When two people speak together, they speak not together, but each in turn. One says something, then stops. The other says something else, or the same thing, then stops. The coherent discourse they carry on is composed of sequences that are interrupted when the conversation moves from partner to partner, even if adjustments are made so that they correspond to one another. The fact that speech needs to pass from one interlocutor to another in order to be confirmed, contradicted, or developed shows the necessity of interval. The power of speaking interrupts itself, and this interruption plays a role that appears to be minor, precisely the role of a subordinated alteration. This role, nonetheless, is so enigmatic that it can be interpreted, as bearing the very enigma of language. Pause between sentences, pause from one interlocutor to another, and pause of attention. The hearing that doubles the force of locution. So it's a pretty loaded quote. I hope I read it slowly enough. But this whole thing in Blanchot, I mean, he continually returns to the idea of interruption as the thing that that kind of structures conversation. And I've been thinking about what this monologue, this kind of essay writing around the conversation might be, which is a bit contradictory, but in some ways it is an attempt to interrupt the flow of ideas around the notion of conversation. You could think of it in that sense. Maybe what I'll do is get straight to the clip here, and I'll just read a little bit of a description. So a recent film that resonates with the question of interruption is Steve McQueen's first feature, Hunger, which concerns the 1981 hunger strike led by Bobby Sands inside Belfast's Maze prison. The film is virtually without speech. It proceeds through a war of gestures, the coldly administered abuse of prisoners in scenes that evoke the inhuman conditions of Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo Bay. And Maze prison in Ireland in this film is really made to look like Guantanamo. I mean, there's repeated scenes where you kind of shudder because you're having flashbacks of the very same images almost on the news, and I think it's very deliberate. And the prisoners' retaliation with acts that perversely aestheticize their abject conditions, under which they are refused political status, and people are reduced to bodies for silent administration. There is one image in particular maybe that I can just quickly show you, which is this swirl of shit that is made by the prisoners. That is made by the prisoners over the course of several days. And this is the swirl of shit shown half washed off, but this is what I'm talking about when I talk about this kind of perverse aestheticization of their own condition, even in this completely kind of bare life situation, they kind of make a Jasper Jones, out of their own excrement, in order to always retaliate with gestures. But the incredible thing about the whole movie is that not a word is said. Really, almost not a word is said until there's one scene where conversation kind of enters to interrupt the entire frame of the film and to set its stakes in a way. So I'm just going to play the clip. You get a bit of a clip at the beginning of how relentless this kind of war of gestures is between the prisoners and...
So what happened to your eye, Bobby?
What?
You gotta dig for yourself, your eye.
Difference of opinion.
How's the other fella?
Oh, that's worse. Believe me.
So, what did you call me here for?
Well, is that the idle banter over with?
Priest etiquette. Start with the small talk.
I'm learning a lot about the priesthood, Don.
You'd make a fine priest.
Why?
Good talker, man of principle, leader of men.
Political terrorist.
The church loves a reformed crook.
Aye. I'm starting a hunger strike on the 1st of March. That's why you're here. That's what I'm telling you.
Aye, I heard that. Does your family know?
I got word out to them, aye.
Have you spoken with them?
Got a visit in 2 weeks' time. We'll talk then.
How do you think they'll take it?
What do you think, Tom?
And your wee boy? So, what makes it different from the last time?
Last hunger strike was flawed. It became emotional. 7 men started at the same time. They all got weak and they couldn't let the weakest one die, which left us susceptible to being conned by the Brits, and that's exactly what we were, conned. This time out, the men will start consecutively 2 weeks apart. Somebody dies, they'll be replaced. There's no shortage of us. 75 men have put their names forward.
Oh, for Christ's sake.
The announcement's being made today.
So what makes this protest different is that you're set to die, Bobby.
May well come to that.
You start a hunger strike to protest for what you believe in. You don't start already determined to die, or am I missing something here?
It's in their hands. Our message is clear. They're seeing our determination.
So it'll take a couple of deaths, do you think? Maybe 5 or 6? But sure, there's 75 of you.
Aye, well, it won't come to that.
All right, maybe the Brits will buckle after 20 or so. But why should you care? Because you're already dead, right? Have you thought about what you're going to be putting these boys through? I mean, putting aside what's going to happen to these poor men's families. You're going head to head with a British government who clearly despise republicanism, who are unshakable. They can easily live with the deaths of what they call terrorists. And the stakes are much higher this time.
I know that.
And if you're not even willing to negotiate, you're looking for them to capitulate. Is that it?
Right.
So failure means many dead men, families torn apart, and the whole Republican movement demoralised.
Aye. Worst case scenario, it might well mean all that. But short term, out of the ashes,
Come on.
guaranteed there'll be a new generation of men and women, even more resilient, more determined.
Look who you're talking to.
There's a war going on. I thought you might understand. You're talking like a foreigner.
You're talking to me like I'm a foreigner. You think I don't know Northern Ireland? I live here, man.
Then support us.
I supported the first hunger strike on the basis it was a protest. Not some pre-designed to die and balk at negotiation other than complete surrender from Thatcher. That's ridiculous, Bobby. It's destructive.
What's happening here for the last 4 years? The brutality, humiliation, our basic human rights taken away from us. All of this has to come to an end.
Through talking.
So what? We take their offer and put their uniform on because the last 4 years have meant nothing. We could do that, Don. Or we could behave like the army we proclaim to be and lay down our lives for our comrades.
Is there not even a small party that's hoping for a breakthrough that could find you negotiating again?
That won't happen.
Right, forget about that. I want to know whether your intent is just purely to commit suicide here.
You want me to argue about the morality of what I'm about to do and whether it's really suicide or not? For one, you're calling it suicide. I call it murder. And that's just another wee difference between us two. We're both Catholic men, both Republicans. But while you were poaching salmon in lovely Kilray, we were being burnt out of our house in Rathcoole.
Right.
Similar in many ways, Dom, but life and experiences focused our beliefs differently, you understand me?
I understand.
I have my belief, and in all its simplicity, that is the most powerful thing.
So what's your statement by dying? Just highlighting British intransigence? So fucking what? The whole world knows what the Brits are like.
Good.
Aye, it is good. And it's nothing to do with you. The Brits have been fucking up everything for centuries.
I can feel your hatred, Dom.
Oh, you looking for martyrdom?
No.
You sure?
Aye.
Because I've heard you eulogising Wolfe Tone, Connolly, McSwinney, all them men. Can't help thinking you're writing your name large for all them history books.
Because you think that matters to me?
Oh, I know it does.
Well, you're wrong.
You see, you soldiers, it's all about the freedom. But you've got no appreciation of a life, Bobby. You no longer know what a life is, you men. 4 years living in these conditions. No one expects you to be normal. There's nothing normal about you. Right now, the Republican movement has talked itself into a corner. You IRA are standing right behind it looking into that corner. All that history. All them dead men and women, you're still seeing nothing. When your answer is to kill everything, you've blinded yourself and you're scared to stop it. Afraid of living. Afraid of talk and peace. So what would Ulster be if it wasn't turning itself to shit? And this situation here, that the future of the Republican movement is in the hands of you men who have lost all sense of reality. You think your head's on right? Locked up in here 24 hours a day and pissing shit. And you are making decisions that could see so many men die. Build a statue to Bobby Sands. You're joking me. Freedom fighter. They're the men and women working out there in the community. And that was you, once upon a time. Am I right? All that work you did in Twinbrook. That's where we need you, Bobby, and you know I'm right.
But I'm deluded. You want me to answer that?
They're beating you, Bobby. You're playing into their hands.
The strategy's in place.
Then stop it. Just say stop.
You don't understand a thing.
You're in no shape to make this call.
It's done. It won't be stopped.
Then fuck it. Life must mean nothing to you.
God's gonna punish me.
Well, if not just for the suicide, then he'd have to punish you for stupidity.
Aye. And you for your arrogance. Because my life is a real life, not some theological exercise, some religious trick that's got fuck all to do with living. Jesus Christ had a backbone. But see then, disciples, every disciple since, you're just jumping in and out of the rhetoric and dead-end semantics. You need the revolutionary, you need the cultural political soldier to give life a pulse, to give life a direction.
Stupid talk, you're deluded.
Aye, so you say.
Yeah, and what's your wee son gonna say? Fuck off. Doesn't that interest you?
You're gonna attack me with sentiment. Typical priest.
What's your heart saying, Bobby?
I thought you'd be all figured out, Dom.
What's it saying? Tell me.
My life means everything to me. Freedom means everything. I know you don't mean to mock me, Dawn, so I'll just let all that pass. This is one of these times when we've come to a pause. It's a time to keep your beliefs pure. I believe that a united Ireland is right and just. Maybe it's impossible for a man like you to understand. But having a respect for my life, a desire for freedom, an unyielding love for that belief, means I can see past any doubts I may have. Putting my life on the line is not just the only thing I can do, Dawn. It's the right thing.
So I just wanted to let that run its course because, first of all, you get the sense at the very beginning how much of an interruption this actual conversation is in the flow of the entire movie. And in that sense, Blanchot's idea that conversation is constituted through a series of interruptions actually takes on almost a different role in that conversation becomes a kind of interruption to the regular flow of events, and it becomes something extremely specific in the course of the life of this movie. So in that sense, it's a kind of example. Also because the stakes of the conversation are so high, it's a matter of life or death. And the priest is really trying to convince Bobby Sands that what he's about to do can maybe be done through more conversation. So he's trying to convince him to, possibly talk to the people imprisoning him, which obviously is not going to be a possibility. And this kind of impossibility weighs down, I think, on the idea of conversation, that when it comes to real matters of life and death, sometimes the conversation is actually something that does not produce. It's a question, actually, it's an open question of whether a conversation does not produce anything or whether nothing is produced because no conversation is actually allowed. We can ask this of many conversations that don't actually happen, that we kind of always hear are about to happen or may be happening in the world, but actually don't happen. And this is outside of the art world. Obviously, I think at the moment we're very interested in conversation, but I don't know if this is also maybe some kind of a foil to the lack of real conversations taking place. There was also something, when I was reading this book of Blanchot's, The Infinite Conversation, it's something that kind of, sometimes you read a book and you think it's actually kind of starting to talk to you as you're writing an essay. And very shortly after I saw Steve McQueen's Hunger, I came across this passage which just turned the book weirder and weirder. And part of the strangeness, I think, of my approach is definitely influenced by Blanchot, but I think what he does is not necessarily just to make it strange for the sake of being strange, but I think he kind of tries to raise the bar. So what he says is that all true discourse is discourse with God, not a conversation held between equals. And he understands this through Levinas, who saying that this is meant in the strongest sense, as one always must. So Levinas means this in the strongest sense, as one always must. Because, Blanchot actually quotes Levinas in this passage, all true discourse is discourse with God. In the strongest sense, as one always must. And in remembering, perhaps, what is said in Exodus of God speaking as one man to another. And maybe this is why the sight of Bobby Sands and a priest, God's ambassador on earth, we could say, talking as equals, comes with a little bit extra force at us. The fact that they're both smoking, at the beginning of the conversation, they're actually both smoking. I find this totally perverse to see a priest smoking. I don't know what it is, but maybe because I grew up in a Catholic country and you just never saw priests smoking, but I find this one of the strongest. The smoking element is actually one of the strongest elements in this entire clip, because it also creates this kind of haze where on the one hand, it's just they're blowing, talking is just blowing smoke. It actually doesn't produce anything. And yet, if you film it, you can see it, that it produces something. It's actually very tangible. So I'm completely of two minds in a way about what exactly is going on with this film. And what's very interesting is that this whole kind of idea that I think it's probably the most uncomfortable I get when reading Blanchot, this whole discussion of God. I'm not sure if, when I started reading it, I kind of thought, oh, do I really want to go there? I mean, this is, I'm a good secular kind of subject, and it's all about being rational and can we keep God out of this? But God becomes something kind of interesting in the course of his discussion as this kind of ultimate other. And I think in this case here, some idea of God as this kind of moral voice, or as something that is completely outside of the human conception of events, is the voice that is not being heard in conversations, let's say. And this God-man duplicity comes back later in the book, when Blanchot talks about Apollo. And Apollo is actually speaking through a poet to Admetus, who is the founder of dialogue. So it's a very plural kind of thing going on. And basically, Apollo says at one point to Admetus, "You are a mere mortal, therefore your mind must harbor two thoughts at once." And I thought, this is precisely how I always think, so there must be some truth in this. So what Blanchot goes on is God fundamentally asking of Admetus. Perhaps nothing less than that he shake off the yoke of the god and finally leave the circle in which he remains enclosed by a fascination with unity. And this is no small thing, certainly, for it means ceasing to think only with the view to unity. And this means, therefore, not fearing to affirm interruption and rupture in order to come to the point of proposing and expressing an infinite task, a truly plural speech. So in a weird way, although this kind of strange cipher of God comes up in Blanchot's notion of the conversation, he actually turns it around, both with this idea that you kind of speak to God as if he was your equal, and also with the idea that you actually get rid of God altogether. So it's a completely kind of confused idea, but at the same time it still exists in there as a kind of strange cipher that makes the conversation interesting, I think. I don't really have the time, I think, to go through Klaus Kinski and a fantastic film that you should also make sure that somehow comes and screens here, which is Jesus Christus Erlöser. And this is a film, it's basically a documentary, Jesus Christ Savior, where, which is the title of a monologue that Klaus Kinski made in 1971 and delivered it at the Documenta Halle. And the film is very different from Hunger. It's a completely hilarious thing in a way, because Klaus Kinski stands up there, and this is kind of what you see for the entire film, except that periodically people try to interrupt him from the audience. So it's just another instance. It's actually the perfect illustration of Blanchot's notion that the monologue is the opposite of conversation. Let's say these are the cops talking to Klaus Kinski, who's decided that all the people interrupting him should be thrown out of the hall. So on to another cipher of Apollo, and this time it's an artist that I think really looks like Klaus Kinski, actually, in some parts, which is Joseph Beuys, who's kind of deified among certain circles, or was, and now he's kind of fallen from grace, but I'm going to try to resuscitate and do something with what he tries, which is a conversation with a rabbit. A bunny, and he decides to talk to the bunny about pictures. And I don't know how many of you have seen the video footage of this work, but for me it's an interesting kind of meta vision of a conversation. The weird thing about it is that in order for this to happen, Boyes kind of takes the human out of the equation twice. Once by covering his head in gold, he kind of assumes the position of Apollo, let's say. And twice, or secondly, by delivering or by enacting this inside of a closed gallery so that people like us would not be admitted to the conversation. We would not be able to hear what is being said. It's just the vision of it, the possibility of it that is at stake in a way. And you know, the photo, the famous photo is kind of what we get at the end. What I'm going to propose that Boyes is kind of looking for here is a kind of very extravagant notion of the neutral. We can just begin to imagine what possibly could be said to a bunny that's dead in order to somehow explain pictures to it. But I think the kind of strange impossibility of the two interlocutors in a conversation, again, plays this game of making conversation into something totally strange, and therefore something that actually may be not happening when we just talk amongst each other. And the idea is, I think, very much conjured here that, you know, something is kind of evoked in the course of this. Something is created, which in the end is the horizon of the conversation. This, I think, is an amazing example. I mean, Boyes is very often, I'm just going to summarize quickly. This is in the essay, but I'll just say it in a few words. But what I found interesting about Boyes is that he's always kind of criticized for being the type of figure that we see in Klaus Kinski, this kind of monological, somewhat deified type figure that that attracts a particular congregation. But what's interesting in the way that Blanchot stakes out the idea of conversation, which is much more, I think, about listening than it is about the question of who's listening and what are you listening to, than the question of who is speaking and what are they saying, is that in a way with this work, which is, you probably all read German because it's close, but the Silence of Marcel Duchamp is overrated, which is kind of a nasty thing, except that it announces a kind of listening to silence that I find extremely interesting. It may be more interesting than another gesture that I thought I would just let hover in the room, which is a conversation with another type of other, not a god, but an animal. So there's kind of two types of others that are not the human, let's say, that kind of engage in conversations in this whole schema. And one is this idea of the deity, that kind of is the moral voice. And then the second is the animal, which is slightly stranger because it doesn't really necessarily have a voice. We're not sure. I'll just play this. Things are going to get lighter.
Est-ce que c'est un bon tableau, celui-là, qui correspond à ce que vous attendez de cette transformation toute récente qui va du conceptual art à cette nouvelle version d'une certaine figuration, pourrait-on dire? Vous croyez? Cependant, cette couleur rappelle quand même nettement la peinture qu'on faisait au moment de l'art abstrait, n'est-ce pas?
This is Marcel Brothers working like steps away from the Alfred Schmeller Gallery in Düsseldorf, where Joseph Beuys was doing the teaching his bunny, his dead bunny, about pictures. And this is at the Département des Aigles, which you probably know, the Museum of Modern Art, the Department of Eagles. So there's a kind of, again, a super extravagant animal, a kind of bestiary that founds the work of both boys and brotteurs.
Que pensez-vous? Parce que en ce moment, beaucoup d'artistes se posent la question. Alors, fermez les musées.
I mean, it continues like this, so I think... Oh, then he starts asking the cat.
Ceci n'est pas une pipe.
This is a pipe.
Ceci est une pipe.
This is a pipe. Oh, the other one was this is not a pipe.
Pas une pipe. Ceci est une pipe. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. Ceci est une pipe. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. Ceci est une pipe. Ceci n'est pas une pipe.
You get the point.
Ceci est une pipe.
Okay. Stop. We could listen to that for a while. I really love this work. However, something bothers me about it, and that is this kind of the position assumed by Brothers in relation to the cat, which is to tell the cat things and expect it to respond. Whereas maybe the more interesting situation would be for the cat to be telling Brothers something, and for Brothers to respond somehow. And Blanchot phrases this in a really strange and nice way. He says, it's kind of in the course of a fictive dialogue, which is actually the way that most of the art of the infinite conversation is written. So a few last words from Blanchot, for whom the idea of conversation resides in a downright weird conception of the interlocutor as possessing a speech beyond hearing and to which I must nonetheless respond. This notion is conjured in a fictive dialogue which includes the following retort. You never really find out in the book who he's speaking to, but there's a kind of, he splits his language in two. So he kind of plays both parts of the dialogue, but some people think it's in somehow a bit of a diary of his relationship with Bataille. Anyway, the retort goes, so then would be my task, to respond to this speech that surpasses my hearing, to respond to it without having really understood it, and to respond to it in repeating it, in making it speak. I'm not sure how we can exercise this hearing. Here is the other great question of conversation, not one of articulating, I think, which is more proper to discourse, but one of hearing, which is proper to a notion of conversation as that which interrupts discourse as we know it. So this is kind of where the first part of the art of conversation ends, and that first essay is really very committed to taking up this notion of the discussion with another and taking it to its most extreme. Although kind of at its horizon was something that was very real and that I observed during the last presidential elections, which was actually during the run-up to the presidential elections when they were still choosing candidates. And I don't know if you remember this, but one of the main points of one of the main moments where Obama really stumbled was during a foreign policy question when he was simply asked, would you talk to Ahmadinejad, Chavez, etc.? And he very quickly, he was the first to answer. He said, of course I would. What is gained by not talking to these people? In fact, I would be really interested in hearing what it is that founds their worldview. The next person to speak was Hillary Clinton, and she slammed him for being a complete political naive. And she basically noted that you never speak to people like that without preconditions. It was something that I haven't really resolved, but it's a very interesting kind of question, not maybe just for Obama and Hillary Clinton, but for all of us in terms of who we admit to a discussion. If the idea is that a conversation is something that can kind of create worlds. So, in a sense, we admit a kind of curiosity of something else. So, even though maybe all these examples sound strange off the bat, there is a kind of horizon of who do we speak to that's very real behind it. How much time do we have left? Wow, 15 minutes. Okay. It might go a little bit over, but we'll be quick. The second essay it was actually written when I was thinking very much about the Rotterdam dialogues, as we called all the symposia that we worked on in Rotterdam, and also somewhat in the lead up actually to the Bergen Biennale conference. So I was continuously asking, what is going on with this incredible drive in the art world towards discursive events that somehow replace actually exhibition making in many ways. They don't just kind of come to the side of as explanatory devices, but they actually replace exhibition making to a large extent. And I was kind of interested in what it means to watch what you say in a way, because I think some of it has to do, and the fact that, you know, most of these events are streamed live or somehow recorded, there's always this question of how are we going to kind of keep this for posterity, because if there is no record in the logic of how we go about things in the art world, it doesn't really exist. I mean, it can come and go, and it's nothing. So I started looking at, sorry, every time I open this, it goes to the beginning. I started looking at moments in art where actually this idea or the record of the conversation is withheld in a certain way, and what possibly can that produce. And I kind of had in the back of my mind, I don't know how many of you have seen this great film, The Conversation, with Gene Hackman, which was released incredibly in the same year as the Watergate scandal, which basically cost Nixon his presidency because he wiretapped. As a Republican candidate, he wiretapped the Democratic National Convention at the Waterhouse Hotel. I'm just realizing this is such an American-inflected talk. I have to watch myself. Next time I do this, there's going to be something happening that is like French, Dutch, Norwegian, I don't know. But anyway, the Conversation is a film where basically Gene Hackman is, there's an implication that he may have cost somebody his life by wiretapping a conversation. But at the same time, in the next one that he wiretaps, he's supposedly the big pro and he can kind of listen to anything. And this is kind of produced in a moment where there is this very, very political urgency in hearing what people are saying and figuring out what is being discussed behind closed doors. So I kind of had this, I don't want to analyze the film, I just kind of have it in the back of my mind, and it's such a great poster. And I just kind of wanted to pose this question of what does it really mean for us to watch what we say? Is it a kind of an attempt, you can be very cynical in this situation and just say we're all narcissists. We don't want to produce exhibitions anymore. We just want to put ourselves on cameras and talk and watch ourselves. I don't think that's the case. I mean, maybe for some people, but But I think there is something very interesting in the same way that when you watch something like Steve McQueen's Hunger, that seeing what happens in a conversation in a kind of film is a beautiful medium for registering not just what is said, but actually also the silences, the pauses, the strange interruptions, the kind of weird time flow. And maybe it cannot necessarily record that extra something that is sometimes possibly produced when you really have a conversation. But I think there is a kind of hope of that in a certain way, that you better record it in case things are produced that you didn't even realize were produced at the time that you were having the conversation. You're so much in the moment, you're talking about various possibilities. You hold things up and let them go very quickly. This better be recorded in case something really good gets said. But there is a kind of counter-example, or a couple in the art world, which rubs against the grain of what we are doing, which is kind of, I guess, in a certain way exemplified by the work of Ian Wilson, who for the last 40 years or so has been basically organizing discussions. He doesn't call them conversations, I should mention. It's interesting. For him, a conversation cannot be what he wants, because a conversation is by definition, and I would probably agree, something without, it's infinite. Blanchot's book is called The Infinite Conversation. I think it's infinite in that it has no end, it has no end point, it has no kind of horizon. It's not, you don't enter a conversation because you have a purpose of arriving at something. You kind of, usually it's actually, the precondition is that it has no horizon, and then something else gets produced. So this is a slightly maybe off-kilter example, but I think it still holds in an interesting way as a foil for what's going on. So he holds these discussions. This is all that is left of them. You just get a kind of A4 piece of paper. I don't know if you can actually read what is being written up there, but I'll read it. There was a discussion in New York City in 1968 on the idea of time, signed Ian Wilson. No mention of how many people were there, no mention of what was said. The kind of, the conspiratorial record of this discussion that you have absolutely no access to is the only thing that you get. And I think it is kind of interesting to consider that Ian Wilson started his work around the time of it's earlier than the Watergate scandal, but it's during the Nixon presidency. So there is this kind of possibility of tapping everything. And incidentally, Nixon and Kissinger wiretapped themselves willfully, and it's all available online. So if you ever want to read those conversations, which are very bizarre because you know that they know they're being recorded, but they think that the other person doesn't know they're being recorded, but in fact the other person is also recording. So it's a really paranoid situation. Another nice work that I came across, it's not discussed in the essays, but I thought this was kind of great in the way that it also posits a kind of tension between art as we know it and conversation. Because I think Ian Wilson really makes an art object in a certain sense. The A4 piece of paper is somehow allows for an economic transaction to take place where that discussion can then be sold as an art object. There's a bunch of negotiations that go along with it, but that's kind of interesting. Lilo Zano did a piece in 1969, so around this time, and I'll just read it. Sorry, I'm going to have to get closer to my screen because I can't quite see what's going on. Okay. Dialogue piece, started April 21st, 69. Call, write, or speak to people you might not otherwise seek, for the specific purpose of inviting them to your loft for a dialogue. And there, I think, it's a nice alignment, but an incredibly colloquial one of this notion of the other, of kind of speaking to people you might not usually speak to. In the process, So then the second paragraph. In process perpetually from date of first call, and then she lists April 21st, 69, date of first. This is strange because it enters the problem of, I guess, thoughts as a tangible property, but she says date of first interest in dialogue, 1948, so a full 20 years earlier. Date of decision, oh my God, date of decision to produce investigation of dialogue, April 8th, 1969. And then there's a note, which is very crucial in some ways. The purpose of this piece is to have dialogues, not to make a piece. No recording or notes are made during dialogues, which exist solely for their own sake as joyous social occasions. This is not this kind of thinking around dialogue and what we do when we get together, I don't think happens anymore, and I'm not sure exactly why. So I kind of feel compelled to bring it up because I do keep asking what is not exactly being said when we do get together. That's something that kind of keeps running through my mind as I'm still completing my review of the Bergen Biennale conference. But I kind of had to impromptu moderate on the last day, and it was an interesting day, I think, because the whole city seemed to show up. Your mayor was here, I think. No, what was this gentleman that came and spoke? The councillor. The city councillor. So it was this very interesting moment, which I don't think happens in many places outside Bergen, to be perfectly honest with you, where there's this impromptu kind of town hall meeting and people do feel in some ways free to speak. At the same time, I keep asking myself who wasn't there and what wasn't said and what did people really want to talk about. And I think that's a really interesting thing to ask in a way, because this is what happens in the art world all the time. You get this incredible critical mass of people, and there's a lot of potential there. And you could be actually talking about whatever it is that you want to talk about. And I'm not sure if the pressure of the cameras or the pressure of being of this somehow happening on the horizon of a work of art is reducing the possibilities of what's talked about or actually upping the ante. I don't have like the answer, but I do want to pose the question because I think it's something to take advantage of since it's happening more and more and more and more. I think we kind of yearn for something tangible to come out of these situations. And a friend of mine who's an artist in Vancouver, Brian Jungen, once made these works which are quite brilliant. They're called talking sticks. And Brian is of Daneza ancestry. There's lots of native people in Canada. That's one nation. And he plays a lot with sports equipment, but in this case, he kind of very, very, very literally took the idea of a talking stick, which is something that you pass around so that conversation flows and that people don't monopolize conversation, and carved into it various words that they have a dry and biting humor around the status of the First Nations, let's say, within the larger political dialogue in Canada. But I tried to use one of these sticks once when I was invited to a discussion. I actually borrowed a stick and we passed it around, and it was a very odd sensation. And it did actually change what kind of occurred, because there was no problem with people speaking over each other, because if you didn't hold the stick, you couldn't speak. And this was also an occasion where I kind of I played a bit of a game or something, you could say, where it was a situation like this. I was kind of invited to talk about the art of conversation, but it was somebody was interviewing me, so it wasn't a monologue. It was a conversation about conversation, which felt a little bit ridiculous. But so there was this feeling of it being ridiculous, and I thought, okay, how do you make it even stranger? And I just asked for all the recording devices to be shut off. Jonas, I had the perverse urge to do just that to you, but I'm not going to. Because we worked so hard to get this working before. But something very interesting happened, which was the moment the electricity was pulled out, it was almost like the entire tension, that kind of social tension or whatever, left the room. And actually, in a certain way, you did need maybe recording devices to up the ante in the room. So that's another open question, I think, is, are we watching what we say too much, or is the recording of all these events possibly going to teach us something in the future about what this moment was all about? I'm going to wrap up with a very old painting, a couple. This is Watteau's painting from 1717 that hangs in the Schloss Charlottenburg in Berlin. It's called The Pilgrimage to the Island of Cythera. You've probably, if you've gone through art history school or anything like that, you've probably seen it as one of those quintessential 18th century paintings that announce a kind of, these are called the fête galante, sometimes also understood as painted conversations by Watteau. And it's an interesting, it's interesting, I think, what Watteau did, because in a way he just registered the fact that people were having conversations. There isn't a huge kind of communication here of what exactly is being said between these people, but we can tell that conversations are taking place, and we can also say there is a kind of critical mass of them, and and that there's a lot of potential here. The interesting thing about this painting, I think, is it's kind of a portrait of the aristocracy at a moment when the tyranny of the King of France is kind of doing them in, and he's demanding too much of their time. And their idea of leisure is being greatly impinged upon. And this is a kind of rather melancholy image of somehow the good old days of a lot of leisure and this kind of ideal, which probably never existed. But, you know, when we're about to lose something, we conjure an ideal golden moment. So I see this as a kind of image of that. The weird thing about the painting is you cannot quite tell if they're on the island already or if they're... It says pilgrimage to the island of Cythera, but the titling of this is a bit ambivalent, and there's been always a question whether they're on the island or not. And the greater question, maybe the greater social question that arises is this kind of aristocracy, this ruling class about to check out of society, or wanting to check out of society or not, to sort of enfold themselves in lovely conversations. I kind of bring this into the fold because in looking at one of these records of conversations, this one was extremely staged. It was a film by Hille Pellig of a kind of event made at Arco. Some of you may know of it. It was called A Crime Against Art, and Anton Vidoclo and Tjerdad Soldar were the defendants, where they were basically on trial for colluding with the bourgeoisie. So the issue of class was on the table, and to what extent artists are now part of a kind of bourgeois norm. And the whole film is highly manipulated in a way, so I cannot be sure to what extent this particular situation is manipulated or not, but at a certain moment, finally, the prosecution just point blank asks the defendant, are you colluding with the bourgeoisie? And there is a weird, weird moment where it's about as long silence as I just gave you. So it's a very uncomfortable thing to hear that much silence after somebody's been asked a question. And then the answer, you can imagine, is, what do you think? Has anybody seen the film? Okay, good. This is nice. The answer is just a very simple yes, actually, which is totally disappointing in a certain way. But at the same time, it stuck with me because it raises the question of whether class is still an issue in the art world. And it's something that I'm kind of struggling to deal with in the next essay of The Art of Conversation. I started with making it as strange as possible. Then I kind of wanted to look at what are the possibilities of it in the art world, what is the horizon, and what does it mean that we're recording so much what we do? And in recording, do we produce less or more? I think that's still a really big and unresolved question. And the practice of Ian Wilson and Lee Lozano definitely pressure in the direction of actually not recording what we do and letting things happen. And Martha Rossler is another person who has pointed out on several occasions that for her, what is happening in the art world right now is some kind of perverse version of a bohemian moment that she experienced. And bohemia is an interesting kind of class construction because it's a willful poverty that's also in some ways playing to an idea of aristocracy. And I think that complexity, that level of complexity of thinking about class is probably what's going to be needed. Because I don't think the question is actually whether or not you're bourgeois. I think things have moved beyond that question. Although I worked recently with Diedrich Diedrichson, who wrote an essay on surplus value, and maybe I'll just wrap up with a quote that he concluded with that stayed with me in a way around this issue of class. Oops. The way this essay is printed, it's really difficult to know where the quote is, sorry. Okay. Excuse me. I don't know if that page is gone, but basically what he questions is... oh, there it is, sorry. Previously, the bourgeoisie was a stable cultural class that had its place at the center of cultural production, which it regulated by means of a mixture of free market attitudes and subsidies, staging its own expression as both a ruling class and a life force that stood in need of legitimation. The bourgeoisie is now fragmenting into various anonymous economic profiteers who no longer constitute a single cultural entity. For most economic processes, state and national cultural formations are no longer as crucial as for the realization of economic interests, as they were previously. As a result, the bourgeoisie as a class that once fused political, economic, and cultural power is becoming less visible. Instead, the most basic economic factors are becoming autonomous. Once these factors become autonomous, the obligation towards cultural values that even the worst forms of the cultural industry kept as standards disappears. So what Diederik Dietrichson kind of posits, I think, is a notion of class that needs to be thought a bit outside of the kind of financial determination that we usually ascribe to it, which is the classic kind of Marxist ideal of owning the means of production. Which class owns the means of production? Although, you know, Marx is kind of critiqued by Bourdieu, who then goes on to show the full construction of culture that's associated with a certain class that owns the means of production. I think what's weird about the art world, and I do think, you know, there is this kind of notion floating around out there that that is called the creative class, which is put forward by Richard Florida, which makes most people cringe deeply. And because it has so much to do with people like us moving into various neighborhoods and gentrifying them. And you know, why do you want to have a biennale in Bergen at a certain moment? Well, maybe Bergen needs a certain amount of tourists, and maybe this can actually jumpstart all kinds of economic forces that will then bring stimulus, although Norway is already wealthy, so as we discovered. Maybe that's not the issue, but there's, you know, the kind of logic of the creative class is always looking at people like us and kind of positing them as this kind of not so romantic avant-garde of a kind of gentrifying force. I'm not sure if that's the most interesting way to think about what is possible, but I do think that class and the idea of class is actually the way to start talking about it, but in some ways it's the thing that's empty from a lot of conversations. So in the next phase, I really want to, and I'm just going to wrap it up, I think. In the next phase, I really want to look at what is impossible to talk about, even more so than before. What is, much more concretely, the kind of, what are the elephants in the room? And to what extent we can use various situations to actually bring those things and create them and discuss them in a real way. Because I don't think they've been talked about, and if they haven't been talked about, if nothing like of that novelty, let's say, has not been created, then if the conversations that we're having do not create things, then they're not really conversations. I'll stop there. Okay.
Are we allowed to ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah. I think you mentioned the top left right here. Recordings.
We have to keep recording for the record.
For the record. I just realized that you mentioned talking sticks. I've been to Vancouver as well, so I know about this. But another thing that came to mind when you said that was, do you know about the art of hosting, which is this, it's organizations, it's one particular organization, but there are many different brands who work really with objects like the talking stick, but also other objects and other methods to create the good conversations. They don't talk about maybe that conversations that do not produce something as not non-conversation, but maybe not the important conversation. So they are looking for finding the environment where the burning questions arise. I went.
But are these organizations that create? Is it like Toastmasters or something of that sort, where you basically have an organization that teaches you how to make a toast at a party or something like that? Or is it more like
a process consultant, maybe.
It's like business networks and those kinds of things.
No, it's not really. I think that, of course, you can make money of it, but that's not the idea of the. That's not the driving force. I think it's really about how to facilitate, how to host a room, how to host the conversation in a room with people. How can I make you tell me what is important to you in the context that is already set? The context for today is the art of conversation, but for another place it might be something else. And I remember that you were asking what are the important questions or the important questions that haven't been asked. And I think that that is, or I know for a fact that that is one of the things that really is important for these, or this organization. Art of Hosting is one organization, but there are many others that call themselves something else. To create a framework or a setting where people do present what is on their mind, and recording is not part of it. Well, anyway, Art of Hosting, maybe check it out. It could be important for your research.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
More questions?
It will remain a monologue. How sad. It probably.
Okay, I have another one. It's not on. It's on. I went to a school that's called the Chaos Pilots, and we are a dynamic project leadership school. We also have a lot of different weird lectures.
You actually you run the school, or you?
No. I was a student.
Oh, you was a student. Okay.
But that's where I also heard about Art of Hosting, because they came one day and had a lecture on how we could facilitate good conversations. But another thing that another lecture that I had during the 3 years, there was not the art of listening, but definitely the importance of listening in various levels that you can listen. So often when you have a conversation, I am more interested in finding your pause so I can introduce whatever is on my mind, which this is from a coaching term. So there was a coach who came in, so not very scientific, but anyway, a model that he worked by. And so he called that like the first level of listening. And then you had the second levels of listening, where you started to become more and more detached from your own, topics that ran in your mind, but actually got engaged in hearing what the other person had to say. And then, of course, at the end, almost turning into a psychiatrist or something, completely passive, just your mother.
Do you think that actually works? Because I think that's, for me, a big question, actually. How can you do that and still actually have a conversation when you render the conversation into this kind of engineered event? I just read for Art Miami Basel, somebody is interviewing Ai Weiwei, and they are the founders of the Institute for Discourse Engineering in Beijing. Ooh. And this sounds to me so scary. I don't really... I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating, but it to me it sort of gets away from the possibility maybe of having a conversation when you begin to engineer it in some ways. I mean, the really interesting thing about Watteau, sorry to bring it back to like this kind of strange painting, but there is a whole there's a very interesting book about Watteau that I'm kind of interpreting in all my readings of his work. And I've got the Jeff Wallop here as a kind of interlude between two Watteaus. This is the paint shop, or this is a sign made for a picture purveyor called Chersin. The Jeff Wall is called Diatribe. And I think there's it's a really weird Jeff Wall, because on some level it's totally constructed, but on some level it looks like a snapshot. It looks completely natural. And I think there is something about it's a very difficult thing to get at in writing or in talking about it, I think, is to kind of bring up the cipher of what is natural, because in some ways we've completely lost touch with that. At the same time, I'm not sure. At the same time, I do want to push it. I think I do want to kind of question to what extent engineered discourse or anything that actually tries to teach people how to have a proper conversation can have a result where you're not so aware of having a conversation that applies to various rules, that you actually forget that you're just there to create something, to kind of conjure, to evoke something that is either the big elephant in the room or... I mean, it's interesting that there is this kind of entire framework built up around the question of what has not been spoken about. And I'm totally guilty of this too, because I've just written 2 big papers and they kind of do the same dance, a slightly different dance, but they do something very weird to conversation. But I think in a way, on one level we can't take it for granted. On another level, the big kind of irony and the bind is that you can't really engineer it.
Okay, then I'm just going to ask a quick, because you asked me whether or not maybe, and I was talking about listening maybe more than the engineered conversation. And of course, if you're looking at a model about, levels of listening, it is engineered, but it was more a practice. But what I realized is that I have had conversations with many people who don't listen to what I say. We are just, it's a formal gesture. I say something, they answer, I answer back. And afterwards, I can't really, I can have problems recalling details. And I know that that's the same for the same person, for the other person. So we haven't been listening. I wouldn't call that maybe a fruitful conversation. It's definitely a conversation. I mean, we spoke words to each other. But it's not a conversation where something has happened. Or... Okay, I'm going to hand over the microphone.
No, but that makes sense. I think it's fine.
Here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question.
It's not so much a question, but a sort of sharing of mixed relationship to the idea of conversation, to your own mixed relationship to it. Thank you very much for your talk. I haven't had the pleasure yet of reading your texts, but I heard about your work before, and it brings me back to 2 projects in Rotterdam that I was part of that were about conversation and that left me with lots of unresolved questions. They're both quite a few years ago. One was a large project with Craigie Horsfield, British photographer who has tried for many years to make his photographic work part of an ongoing conversation with different partners. And the aim of that project was not just to have conversations, but to make the conversations about conversation, or as Craigie Horsfield would always say, lovers talk about love, conversationalists talk about conversation. And the other project was an initiative by curator Annie Fletcher and artist Sarah Pierce. And instead of producing an exhibition at Witte de Wit and Tent, which they were asked to do, they initiated a reading group that had conversations for a while. And both of these projects were highly interesting as long as we were in conversation. The problem started when the conversation somehow had to translate itself into an event. And this also makes me think back about what is this discursive event in the world of art really? Because there is some kind of contradiction also between the art of conversation and it being an event. The conversation being something that happens between a group of people with a certain level of trust, and like you said, no clear purpose. It can go here, there, and anywhere, and what it first of all produces perhaps is a sense of being together. Whether you are connecting or disconnecting, it's a sense of being in that situation together. So perhaps it produces a sort of small community, but that community isn't public as itself, and hence it seemed also to be in friction with the idea in the art world of the public. Because as soon as this community had to share what it was doing with the public or continue it or extend it, something started really breaking down. So in the case of the Craigie Horsfield project, what was produced as a public event in the end was an exhibition and an effort to continue conversations and invite members of the public to be part of it. But what they were always asking us is, what have you been doing and what was produced? And we would always say, it doesn't matter what was produced between us. What matters is what we can produce here together now. And this was incredibly frustrating to the people that we tried to expand our art of conversation to. They thought in a way it became a matter of secrecy or arrogance or being besides the point. So to say the point was the art of conversation, rather than to say the point is what is produced and here is that special knowledge that we have produced, that became sort of a friction. And something very similar happened with that reading group project, where also there was a sort of public event. And again, the audience said, tell us what you read, tell us what you thought, tell us what you concluded. And we said, it's not about that. It's about sharing with you what it might be that a public institution hosts a non-public reading group. And so I think both projects were incredibly productive for us who were in it, but it raised lots of questions that we kind of didn't resolve and that seemed to be at the edge of this problem of conversation working in a particular way, because even if it's recorded, it's still not yet public, it's not performed publicly. And then the pressure within a world that at the same time, as much as it loves discursive events, to pressure for it to do things for the public, that translation somehow not working. And I'm still struggling with that. The projects were incredibly meaningful for me. They made me actually step out of this public institution. But I don't know, somehow I recognize a lot of the things you were saying there, and they translate.
I've worked
back.
with Sarah before,
yes.
so, and we've spoken about this actually in a really interesting way. And I think, I mean, we were in a seminar with Irit Rogoff together, and in that seminar we circled around this issue as well. And one thing that Irit Rogoff always floats out there as a possibility is that, in a way, art is a kind of smoke screen or something that kind of you can put in place, and it's there, and people gather around it, like the monolith in 2001 or something like that, I don't know. But then you can do a lot around it that's out of the official event itinerary. And perhaps that's a more interesting way of having a conversation. I always felt a little bit strange about that, because I treat, and maybe it's partly my thing, but I really, I would say that it's more interesting maybe to turn that art then into a conversation piece, you could say. That's a whole other big. So I'm just going to put it out there and see what happens. But I completely thank you for those very detailed descriptions. It's really good. But I do think the event, actually, the idea of the event is a really interesting thing to bring into the thinking around conversation, because I think in some ways the question has to be asked whether it can be an event. And if it's not an event, then to what extent it relates to events, because I think it actually really does. But it's not maybe the event, it's not like center stage.
Yeah. And maybe another thought that I now had, that when you spoke about class, was that somehow the response that occurred in this moment of, and I agree with you, you don't have to translate it into an event or think in those terms, but that is what happened with both these projects. And that's where all the contradictions became apparent. But somehow what happened is that at that very moment of others trying to understand and place what the conversation had been and what it meant, and the decision of these two groups to stick with the idea of conversation being the point, not just a means to an end, was that it kind of recalled this idea, which I think is a British idea, of the chattering classes.
Oh yes, totally.
You know, when you talk about a class, there is this word, the chattering classes, which are the classes that are rich enough and free enough to just talk, engage in conversation. And in a way, that is a derogatory term. That kind of was exactly how these groups were perceived. They were somehow doing something that others couldn't afford, or that was very special, that it could be afforded, and hence it didn't mean that we belonged to a certain class, but almost that we created a certain class of that little community.
I mean, that's actually, in a way, I think the wrong question is the question of the bourgeoisie. I think the right question for us is the question of the aristocracy. Maybe that's why I also kind of bring up the Watteaus. A funny thing, I'm not going to mention names, but one of the most interesting conversations I had at the Bergen Biennale conference was a kind of speculation on whether or not it would be more interesting to elect kings rather than presidents, and how that would restructure our entire social system, and to what extent it would finally afford us that leisure that we so desperately all crave to talk more, pretty much. But yeah, thank you, that's interesting. The chattering classes, that's like Dr. Johnson or something like that, probably. Yeah, thanks.